Okay, good afternoon, morning, whatever the time it is when you watch this. British and American culture people. Yesterday was the English Festival, and I just want to congratulate the cast. A few of the major actors disappeared right after the show, so I didn't get to really say how impressed I was with the performance. It was a lot of fun, and I was entertained, and there was a lot of people there. My daughter was also with me, and she was the youngest person there, and she liked it too. So it was a show for people of all ages, I guess. Anyway, thank you for putting in the hard work, the extra time to make that event, a success. Back to our regular scheduled programming. What's going to happen, those of you who went to practice your rehearsals after the quiz, you probably didn't hear that we're going to have quiz number 5 this Friday, and then quiz number 6 the following Friday, just because we only have a month left. So there needs to be like a little bit of a gap between the last quiz and doing a review for the final exam. And on the very last class of the semester, I will be at a conference in Seoul. So the exam will most likely be scheduled for let me see, it's the 14th. Actually, a student asked me already. Usually we don't know ahead of time, this far ahead of time, when the exam's going to be, but the schedule is tight, and I know there's some students that are from other countries. We have foreign exchange students and full-time foreign students. So if you're planning to leave the country, you have to leave after the 14th, because the 14th is the day of the exam. If you have, I know one particular student has a personal reason why they won't be here for that. If you, for some reason, have a legitimate excuse for not being in the country or being present because of a medical issue or something like that, then you have to come and speak to me as soon as possible. Otherwise, December 14th is the exam. So let's get into more stuff from chapter 5. I want to preface this lecture by saying, unlike the previous lecture, I'm going to follow the textbook. I'm going to follow the textbook because it makes it easier for you to study, but I do need to reorganize some of the stuff. I think I prefer to talk about the American stuff more, about the westward expansion, the Louisiana Purchase, and Republican virtues, and Thomas Jefferson's idea of the agricultural republic. I'd prefer to talk about the Civil War and the Gilded Age now, but that's not the way I organized the book. So the next edition, I think I'm going to switch things up and do all the American 19th century stuff together, which I didn't do. So what's going to happen today is we're going to briefly talk about the Industrial Revolution in general, as we did on Friday's class. Then we're going to talk about American things a little bit, but the majority of the lecture is going to focus on the British, and that's why the title of the lecture is Pax Britannica, which I explained in last class is the term for a British peace, relative peace, where there was no major world wars like the Napoleonic Wars or the 7 Years' War. Both were global conflicts, mostly between France and the French Empire and the British Empire, but including many other countries too. The Russians, for example, the Spanish, and Prussians, which will, transform into Germany at the end of the 19th century. So, to begin with, let's just talk about industrialization. I think the reason we call it a revolution, even though, as I explained, it's so slow, it happens over decades, and it's like a multi-generational thing, which means it's not a true revolution, but it does change life for everyone. In terms of life expectancy, health in general, access to food and things like that, the industrialization is a positive thing. Sometimes people make the argument that, it makes people sick, but we know that's not true. You compare, although we have COVID and we have climate change problems now, if you look at 1750 compared to 1950, for example, for any industrialized nation, the standard of living is incomparable. Lifespans are longer. The inventions, the medicine, the ability to transport and communicate, the education levels are completely different. The Industrial Revolution changed any country who goes through that process is transformed. And that doesn't mean it's a good thing, but just if you measure it, empirically measure it, like as I said, standards of living improve. Not necessarily immediately, they might drop in the short term, but over the long term, like I said, look at 1750 compared to 1950, all the nations, we call them developed nations now. And that's because they've industrialized, and that makes them developed. It transforms all aspects of their life, economic, education, all facets are affected. So let's also qualify all those improvements by the negative things that industrialization does. Obviously, the number one thing, like I said, is pollution. And even when they were doing this stuff, I mean, the people who were inventing things like, I said James Watt invented the steam engine, and all the subsequent inventors who are largely Scottish, English, and American, from other countries too, but primarily those from the British and American group at first, because they were the early industrializing nations. Now, inventors and scientists discover things from across the world. At the time, the major inventions that pushed industrialization forward came from British inventors and American inventors. They were very aware of the effects of pollution, not on a global scale, but in Victorian England, there's an anecdote of people, Queen Victoria herself in the carriage, going into northern England and like coming over a hill and just seeing the sky, the smog, the black clouds and soot, of the coal burning, engines that are the backbone of the cloth production, the textile industry. And Manchester, as I said, being one of the places that people called the workshop of the world. You were probably more familiar with people calling China the workshop of the world, because when China industrialized with its huge population, of course, the manufacturing, and it's also the labor, again, it's a matter of how much it costs. The Chinese were able to leap forward. I think that's actually what Mao called it. But he had, we have to separate communism and political things from everything else. But China has become sort of neo-communist country that has a huge productive capacity. And the way that they became rich is by becoming the workshop of the world in the end of the 20th century. 200 years earlier, that was the work, that the resources were sent to the major manufacturing centers in the United Kingdom. when you went over the crest of a hill and saw the darkness and the black clouds and the soot and everything, you know, people's faces and hands, and then you can just, you know, it's almost like the entire place is covered in black dust all the time. Some, I've heard, and I can't confirm this, but that J.R. Tolkien, the writer, the famous Oxford professor, linguistics professor, who wrote the series Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, I'm sure all of you know, Pandak Jewang, something like that. I can't remember how to say it in Korean exactly, but Ring Lord, right, in Korean. That the inspiration for Mordor, for, you know, where Sauron lives, that volcano in that sort of cratered pit where it's just like always raining fire and black smoke perpetually hangs over the entire kingdom of Mordor. That the inspiration for that was the great industrial centers of northern England. They're largely post-industrial now. So actually, when I went to London in 2011, it was just before the Olympics, of course, so they were cleaning everything up. But blue sky every day. I didn't see any of the smog or even rain or fog. But in England, it is very rainy and foggy frequently. Some people think that the moderate climate with this, you know, like kind of gloomy, naturally gloomy, cloudy weather is a depressing thing. But I saw none of that. I went in October, and I don't think there was a cloudy day. I was there a week, and I was in London the whole time, and it was bright blue sky, and I was like, well, it doesn't seem like the same place that I've read about or heard about, that things have been transformed. Sorry, let me adjust my camera here. Seems to be off center. Okay, so there, you know, they could see that the environment was getting damaged, and as a consequence, as a reaction to the idea of, you know, reason and common sense driving this realistic perspective of the world, which included science, right? Science and reason. This is the Enlightenment philosophy that humanism, that human beings can take control of their environment and they can improve themselves by that. The Romantics looked at the Enlightenment, this idea of reason and common sense, and human beings being, you know, creatures that can improve themselves through these scientific and means of reason and science. They looked at the damage to the environment and said, well, this is unnatural, and this is terrible for not just for medical reasons or for health reasons. It's terrible because it's dehumanizing. It's a human-centered point of view, but it's based on human beings doing unnatural things, right? That you're destroying nature, and this is not the way human beings are supposed to live. Yeah. So the pollution is one sign of that. The dehumanizing aspect, like you don't make things with your hands anymore. You just operate machines. You're a secondary factor, and all of the work is separated. You only just, for example, a shoemaker, before the Industrial Revolution, you would go to get your shoe made, and they would measure your foot, and then they would make the entire shoe. The shoemaker would make it to customized to your foot, and they would do the whole process from the beginning to the end. In the Industrial Revolution, they separated that work into many different parts, right? So you would just, you know, one person would do the sole, the bottom of the shoe, and then the next part would be glued on by the next person, and then the next, the canvas or the leather part would be sewn on by the next person, and so on. And that way you could do it much faster, and you could produce many things. But this is a very repetitive, monotonous thing. You just do the same thing over and over and over again, and it gets worse as industrialization, increasingly specializes things, you end up, you know, by the end of the Industrial Revolution, or you might say, when you're going to like the second Industrial Revolution, and you have, you know, you're starting to build cars. I mentioned Henry Ford briefly for other reasons, but when you start having things like you're doing an assembly line where all you're doing is just drilling 10, you know, holes in a piece of metal, and then the next it's a door, and you drill 10 holes in it, and then you drill 10 holes in the next door. You do that over and over again. People hated that. People still hate it. I worked in a factory during university, and that was one of the reasons that I became an English, you know, a scholar. That's why I ended up being a professor. It wasn't my necessarily my plan to become an English professor, but I say this to many of my classes. All I really knew was that I didn't want to be in a factory, and I didn't want to drill 10 holes in a door all day, every day. I found it dehumanizing, boring, and of course it's also dangerous. Nowadays you have to wear, sometimes you have to wear helmets, or you have to wear masks, you know, to prevent inhaling dust or chemicals or whatever, and steel-toe boots. And sometimes you have, you know, suits that are protective layers to protect your skin, that kind of stuff. None of that stuff existed. So lots of people were injured and lots of people died because of the nature of the machines, and how, you know, how complicated. Well, we would not think they're that complicated, but to them it was very complicated, and you needed to like sometimes fix things or replace things, or like go into small places. So actually, you know, children were employed in very dangerous ways because they were small enough to go into the machine, to go into places that a larger person couldn't, like a man could not, or a woman. So they would send the kids in there, and the machines would be operating, they would be running, and then they would send a kid into the machine to fix it, or to get a part, or to move something, because they couldn't get inside because of the small space. It's pretty shocking disregard for the safety of children or anybody, really. And then there's the scheduling, what we do now with our phones, and setting alarms, and getting up and always knowing what time it was, having the same schedule, the 9 to 5 workday, and all that kind of stuff. None of that existed. One of the reasons that industrial time was created was because of the trains. Once they had transportation, they had to, you know, synchronize. You know, they made train schedules, and you could know. Before, you would just like go from, you know, you go from Liverpool to London, and it would take whatever amount of time it took to ride your horse, or to walk, or to ride in a carriage. But once they had trains, they could actually control when you would arrive. And they also realized that, you know, the sun is moving, and time depends on where you are. Like in Eastern England, the sun comes up earlier, even though it's not a very good country. Sorry, not a very good country. Very big country. It's still a good country. Sorry about that, Britain. But you know, the sun would come up in the east, and then, you know, it wouldn't come up for another 20 minutes on the west coast, whatever. In America, it was, once they started expanding across, you know, as we know, there are 24 time zones around the world, and we all follow those, you know, clocks. And Greenwich Mean Time is the standard for the industrial time that eventually was implemented for the entire world. And Greenwich is, of course, a village that is now in the middle of London. So we don't know what it's like to not follow that kind of schedule, including me. This industrial time thing is several hundred years old now. And then we have digital time that comes later. But you can imagine for people who, the majority of them were farmers, or some sort of, they lived in the countryside, that the natural rhythm of waking up with the sun and working during daylight hours and having flexibility of just not coming in and punching in at 7 o'clock every morning and punching out at 7 o'clock at night. Because, you know, during the beginning, there wasn't really any work unions or protection for workers in the beginning either. So, you know, the 12 or 14-hour workday, 6 days a week was the standard, not 9 to 5, 5 days a week. The 40-hour work week is a 20th century, you know, a phenomenon. When the Industrial Revolution began, people were working much longer days and weeks. You'd have, most people would have 6 times 12, right? Which is, that's something even the hardworking, you know, even the workaholics would have a hard time swallowing 72-hour work weeks, week after week. I've done that kind of work, 12 hours a day, 6 hours. You burn out pretty quick. Doesn't matter what task you're doing, but this is what the industrial schedules were like. Okay, so on the, as a product of, these things sort of interact with each other, and they cause this acceleration of various things. So transportation improves. You get railroads connecting cities, and many people can move. Whereas people very rarely would, you know, go from one, you know, city to another in England. Now we have people doing business trips and they're flying across the world. In the past, it was just like, you know, only very wealthy people would travel from city to city or village to village. People like Queen Elizabeth would go across country on a tour to make sure everybody could see her, Queen Elizabeth I, that is, in the 16th century. But largely everybody else would very rarely travel. There is a tendency as wealth, economic development, and industrialization occur in Britain for the wealthy families to start sending their children to Europe to kind of do a European tour, just to be exposed to culture and language and ideas and politics and stuff as a kind of like, I don't know, finishing school for them, to prepare them for aristocratic life and for perhaps like a political career, right? So there's a transportation revolution that occurs as well. We'll talk about that a bit more when we flip over to America, about Civil War stuff next week. The British Postal Service was a marvel. We take for granted that you can just pick up your phone, you can instantly talk to somebody on the other side of the planet. This is a relatively new phenomenon. For them, the idea that you could write a letter, and once industrialization had run its course in the 19th century, in England, you could write a letter in the morning, and the letter might be delivered by the afternoon, early afternoon, and received, and the person would write a letter back. And within the same day, it was possible to send a letter in the early morning and have a letter be returned by the end of the day, right? This to them, the idea of communicating with somebody 100 kilometers away within one day was amazing, magical, right? It was something to be able to communicate like that, to have a system that would allow you to communicate within a single day was something incredible. In India, by the end of the 19th century, the British Postal Service is doing this too. And it's the British Postal Service, but a lot of the people are Indian, and they're using various means. Sometimes they're running, you know, across countryside, delivering things. They're using trains and horses and everything, and the British postal system coordinates everything and schedules everything, and they can deliver messages very, very quickly. It's considered one of the major revolutions as well, this communication revolution. And in America, the American Postal Service when it becomes developed by the Civil War, the middle of the 19th century. It's the biggest. It has more employees. It's the biggest part of the government, of the American government, is the American Postal Service. So you get the idea of how important the Postal Service is, the ability to communicate and correspond with people quickly, how this accelerates invention, education, and all of these things interact, make people, the communication allows businesses to thrive and more factories to be made and more inventions to be created, and it just kind of snowballs. So there, the next I just said, inventions, trains, eventually cars. That's not in the first industrial revolution, that's in the second. That's at the end of the 19th century that you start getting cars being tested out. Electricity, the telephone, photographs, and what they call moving pictures, right? The telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, there's a picture of him, I believe, at the beginning of the book in the introduction section. There were many American inventors. Benjamin Franklin was one before the Industrial Revolution started in America. He was already doing experiments with electricity, but in terms of, using the electricity for something, the light bulb, the man is Thomas Edison, who invented many things. He was one of the pioneers of moving pictures too, what we call movies, film. He was a genius. He was a polymath, and he invented all kinds of different things, eventually inventing, over 1,000 different devices and owning the patents for them. Thomas Edison, Westinghouse, which is still electrically, that's the guy who invented alternating current. The electricity that Edison used was DC, and Westinghouse invented AC, so you have alternating current and direct current. You may know the rock band AC/DC, that's their name. We have two ways of transmitting electricity, alternating current and direct current. I mentioned James Watt already. He was British, and that's how we measure the units of power. And the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell. There was many others, but those are some of the major ones. The second agricultural revolution, I don't know if it's actually technically correct to call it that anymore. I might change how I say that in the book, but that's how I write it in the book. The second agricultural revolution uses industrial power, obviously, but there's in the Middle Ages, there are some inventions like the plow and using horses instead of oxen, and field crop rotation and stuff like that. These things have already been invented, but now we've got a massive increase in power and productive capacity, and we have the huge, territory of the United States in which these tools can be used to produce more food. So you get, probably you don't know the company John Deere, but the John Deere plow and the John Deere tractor become essential parts of the American agricultural and industrial revolution, which increase the productive capacity many, many times. There is a guy there was a guy named Thomas Malthus, who is a religious person. He was a minister, but he wrote in 1798, he wrote a theory that there would be the population would increase exponentially because people were having big families now, and the death rate had dropped. So many of the children survived. Of course, there was lots of big families before, like 6 or 7 or 8 kids, but they wouldn't survive till adulthood. But now many of them were. So you're getting a population explosion. And that's the exponential increase of people would not be able to, the increase in agricultural capacity would not be able to keep up. It would increase arithmetically, whereas a population increase could be exponential. So he proposed this theory, the Malthusian theory, that there would be overpopulation and mass starvation. It would be a catastrophe. However, he was mistaken. There was actually such an increase in the capacity to produce food, especially in America, that there was a surplus of food, which drove the price down. We're again, I think Malthus was maybe hundreds of years ahead of crisis, which he foresaw. And so far, we've been able to come up with ways to increase our food production. We still don't distribute it evenly. So there are countries that with people that are starving. There's about 20 million people on the edge of poverty, starving every year, that are dying. And that's a lot of people. But there's, you know, almost 8 billion people in the world now, by some counts. The population clock is well over 7 billion. And the majority of these people have enough food. We take it for granted that there's always going to be food in the refrigerator, and the grocery store is always going to have food. In fact, we throw out. One of the great tragedies is we're making enough food to feed everybody on Earth, but you know, in developed countries, we have more than enough food, and we bring it home and we don't eat it and we throw it in the garbage, and the stuff that doesn't get sold in the grocery store also is wasted. He didn't anticipate our capacity to, you know, do this, but the combination of climate change and perhaps, you know, the manipulation of species, you know, GMO modifications of seed and, you know, having less biodiversity and less sustainable agriculture and factory type farms, gigantic farms with like hundreds and hundreds of cows in Texas and stuff, diseases, all these things could cause this precarious, Malthus thought, this precarious position where our population is always increasing, but if the food production can't keep up, then we would have a catastrophe. And a lot of people are predicting that by the year 2100, that will be the case. The population will be too large, and because of the environmental damage, largely started by the Industrial Revolution in industrial practices, we will have mass starvation, climate refugees, and as a result, probably war. Not to be super pessimistic, but let's be realistic as well. So, as I said, we're going to come back to this stuff. This is more American. So about the Enlightenment and the reaction to it, the Romantics saw the Industrial Revolution as a terrible thing. So in the book, as going forward for the rest of the chapter, I focus a lot on Nelson and the sea power that he represented for Britain. Britain decided that because of their economic success, industrial success, financial stability, and the fact that they're an island, and that their dependence actually on the imperial system, that the best thing for them to do would be to dominate the waves, rule the waves. I'm going to play the song for you, Britannia Rule the Waves, which is an 18th century song, but continues to sort of inspire British people whenever they hear it, some kind of strange patriotic sense of pride, even though their navy is quite small and dwarfed by, you know, China or the American Navy, or India as well. India has a pretty large navy these days. But at the time, the British fleet dominated. They fought, as I said, a series of about 7 wars, culminating in the Battle of Waterloo, where the Duke of Wellington in 1815 defeats Napoleon. And the struggle for empire is lost by the French. And they still retain their empire, but there's not a contest for world domination. The British win that contest. So with France being subdued, still an empire, but subdued and not competing for domination of the world's oceans, we have this period called the Pax Britannica, which lasts from 1815 to 1914, the beginning of World War I. And as I said, one of the reasons for World War I is the fact that other countries caught up and challenged the power of the British, in particular Germany, but Russia and France and the United States as well. Anyway, way back at the beginning of Napoleon's imperial career, French Revolution is over, and it's the early 19th century. He goes to Egypt and takes over Egypt temporarily. Nelson is down there, and he manages to defeat. He has a battle at the mouth of the Nile, and he annihilates the French fleet there, which is supposed to take Napoleon back and supply his army and take him back to France. But Nelson destroys the French fleet. So now Napoleon is stranded in Egypt. He manages to disguise himself and escape and leave his army in Egypt to surrender to the British. This all happens just before 1800. But he salvages his reputation somehow, and the French Revolution is already going sideways. So he stabilizes everything and turns it into an imperial system and crowns himself in a ceremony as the Emperor Napoleon I. All of this happens, and Napoleon, as you know, was a genius, a military and political genius, and he started taking over every country, every kingdom, every empire in Europe one by one, until he controlled basically the entire continent, and it was knocking at the door of Russia. But before he did that, just like Hitler would do in World War II, you take over the entire continent and want to deal with Britain. He didn't want the British to be free to attack him from the back if he was expanding eastward through Poland and towards Russia. He didn't want the British to be landing in Spain and in France and attacking him, attacking the French Navy. So he wanted to deal with the British first, and he had La Grande Armée. His great army was in France, ready to go across to England, but Nelson and others were, again, in the English Channel. This is sort of like a Spanish Armada type thing. They're in the ocean, patrolling and looking for the French fleet and looking for an opportunity to stop them. And so Nelson is chasing French and Spanish ships all over the place. And actually Spain is nicknamed by French historians the Spanish ulcer, because Napoleon ends up spending so many resources trying to suppress Spain. And the word guerrilla comes from the type of fighting that the Spanish did, hiding in the woods and hiding in the mountains and attacking everywhere in small groups. Guerrilla warfare, this is comes from the Spanish resistance. And he could never fully control it. And Portugal was an ally of the English, and the English kept helping the Portuguese fight against the French as well. So Spain is a big problem, but he has sort of control of Spain at the same time. And the combined fleet of Spain and France outnumbers the British fleet. Nelson's fleet is about twice as small. So he's outnumbered 2-1. But nonetheless, he's just like Yi Sun-shin, he's not intimidated by the number of ships. He believes that his men and his technology, his ships, the morale, and his tactical and strategic ability are superior. So he's chasing them all over the place, trying to find a battle, and he does this. In 1805, he meets them at Trafalgar, and if you go to, it's one of the coolest things, I think. Just like I like the statue in Seoul of Yi Sun-shin, holding his hand on his sword, and then there's Sejong sitting in his throne. You got those giant statues downtown Seoul, right in front of the palace. They're cool statues, whatever they mean, or to Koreans or to foreigners. All that aside, they're just they look powerful. They look interesting. and they're important moments in Korean history. So that's why they're there. You can go to Trafalgar Square, which is in the center, just down the street from Buckingham Palace and Westminster. There's a square, and there's the pillar with Nelson standing on top, looking out down the Thames towards the English Channel, towards France. In 1805, at Trafalgar, he meets them. They have a battle. I won't explain the tactics to it, but it's a very, very aggressive move where he attacks directly the French and Spanish line, and you're not supposed to do this, but attacks them headlong, and they're all firing, and he splits the line, and they rip apart this French and Spanish fleet, and he is shot and killed in the process. This battle, this defeat, makes it impossible for Napoleon to attack England. He doesn't have the ships or the money or the navy, the sailors to replace what his losses at Trafalgar. So that's the end of. He continues to win battles. His army is unstoppable until he ends up being frozen in Russia in 1812. But no more grand adventures or attempts to attack England. England is safe because of Nelson. So his reputation and his presence and his charisma, his courage, all of those things are legendary, and that's why he's included in the textbook. The way that the British got enough sailors together was quite scary, and what can I say? Socially, if you were a person who lived in a coastal city, they had these, basically they were like paid police officers, kind of. They're soldiers that are employed by the Navy. They were called press gangs, and they would just round up criminals, people who were drunk, people who were on the streets, unemployed people, whatever. We'd just grab them, kidnap them essentially, and then put them on a ship, and then, you know, go out to sea, so that you'd, you know, wake up in the morning or the next day and you'd be out in the ocean and you'd be a member of the Imperial Navy. That's how they got enough sailors to man the ships, to operate the ships, is by basically grabbing people off the street. They did this and you didn't really, I mean, you would think that kind of thing would be illegal, that we have human rights and all that kind of stuff. They would be paid, but a lot of people didn't want to go out on the ocean for a year or two and run the risk of course, dying or getting sick or getting injured or whatever. So that's the way they solved the problem, is by just, these press gangs just roamed around at night, in the morning, early morning, finding anybody, grabbing people out of prisons and putting them on the ships and sort of forcing them into military service in the Navy. They needed a lot of sailors in order to fight against Napoleon's fleets. And that's how they did this. And they did this in other times too, but especially when they were fighting against France during the French Revolutionary Wars and against Napoleon. Okay, so that's the stuff about Napoleon. Please read about what I say in the book about Charles Dickens. He's got lots of famous characters. The Victorian workhouse was a notorious place where orphans and young people and unemployed, and as I said, all those people, there was still a sense that people were lazy, and that there was a deserving and undeserving poor. And if you were, you know, undeserving, then it was your responsibility. It was the government's responsibility to make you do work. So they would take you, whether you were an orphan child or you're an unemployed person or you just couldn't find work or you were homeless, then they would send you to a workhouse and you would have to live there, and you get paid a small amount. I sort of explained this idea already. It gets worse during the Victorian period. I have to mention as well for the students, when they're talking about contradictions, I said it has to be an American contradiction, but there's plenty of contradictions in British society here too. If you read about the Victorian stuff, you will see Queen Victoria, you know, on one hand, Victorian society was affluent, conservative, religious, and moralistic. But on the other hand, they were sort of, I mean, feminists certainly don't like Queen Victoria. She was actually, many of the women who are promoting women's rights and thought that women should be treated, you know, they were promoting equality and women having political careers or voting rights and various things, even just being treated, you know, as a person on the same level as a man. Queen Victoria was not supportive of these things at all, even though she was the queen. And her husband was a prince from Germany, Prince Albert. And she was technically, you know, more powerful than him, but she sort of played the domestic role very well. That's what she believed. And she had a lot of children, and those children married various important aristocrats, the most important being the Tsar in Russia and the Kaiser in Germany. So in World War I, the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser in Germany, who were at war, they're actually cousins. And because their grandmother is the same person. Their grandmother is Queen Victoria. That ends up in tragedy for both sides. Anyway, read about Queen Victoria, and there's Victorian fashion, there's Victorian architecture, there's Victorian ideas, there's the whole, she was a queen for a very long time. She had a diamond jubilee, so she was, you know, she was on the throne for 60 years. After her husband died, she loved Prince Albert. It's a very sort of romantic story, I guess, that they really loved each other and were very dedicated to each other. And when he died, she used to wear black and never smiled again. And she lived for a long time. So there was a very dour, sober and somber queen for, you know, decades at the end of the 19th century. She's an interesting person, but I think she's very representative. A lot of tension between aristocracy, human rights, gender, roles, many things in Victorian society that are issues. So Jane Austen writes at the beginning of the 19th century. So, and she writes these very complex, social, female-oriented novels. She's probably the most famous one is Pride and Prejudice. And her characters are very, very vivid. And she paints a picture of English aristocratic and social life in which you can really get a woman's perspective. And so she is sort of revered as one of the pioneers of women's writing. And you know, she had to do a lot of her writing secretly, and she had to publish her books anonymously, but posthumously, she's recognized as one of the greats. And all subsequent female writers have to acknowledge the influence of Jane Austen, right? So that's why she's included there too. Again, Mark Twain, I need to sort of reorganize things. Mark Twain, back to the other side of the pond, the other side to America. Mark Twain is a pioneer of American literature. You may have noticed there's not that many, in the 19th century is when American literature kind of explodes. And you get from the mid 19th century onward, you start to see some very, very interesting styles, and American literature find its voice and proliferate and become a rival for the British literary tradition. Mark Twain is a large part of that. He wrote in the 19th century, and Huckleberry Finn is his sort of iconic work, where an escaped slave named Jim and an orphan boy named Huckleberry Finn, they pull down the Mississippi River, and they have various adventures together. And Mark Twain has a particular style where he doesn't filter the people's voices, that they actually, you know, his writing, actually you can see the sound of the way Jim talks and the way Huck talks. He actually writes it. People were quite critical of that he didn't clean up the characters' accents, and like he intentionally, you know, wrote bad grammar. There was a sense that if you wrote like that, the way that people actually talk, that this would make everybody stupid, and that literature should always be perfect, and the characters should always speak with correct grammar and spelling, and without, you know, inflection, dialect, you know, dropping sounds. But, you know, whenever you write this, we say, okay, that's not how you write going to, but that's how you say it. You know, you owe a little bit to Mark Twain when you do that, because that's the kind of thing that he did. He wrote, especially the dialogue is very interesting, how he took off the filter that people normally would put over their characters, and make sure that when people are speaking, they're speaking as if they're all university professors who don't make any technical errors when they speak, right? Not true in real life, even of American or British or Canadian professors. So that's these at the end of the chapter. That's what you get, is a little bit of literary culture and perspectives on society. We already talked about capitalism. Adam Smith is on page 164 because his ideas were so important. Again, as I said, America became a very literate society in the 19th century. Scotland, it happened earlier. The Scottish Presbyterians established universities, and they learned to read the Bible. And then from there, they went into philosophy and medicine and law and politics and economics. And there's a huge group of Scottish people in the Enlightenment. They're giants, even though it's a tiny country. And so in the 19th century, American Presbyterians, who are only several generations, you know, some of them are Scottish Presbyterians, but now they're American. The same thing happens. They start establishing colleges, and they start studying, and they start developing law and science and so on. Princeton University established the Presbyterian Seminary in 1812. I know that because there was a war between Canada and, well, Great Britain and America, but it was the Canadian territory against the United States. There was a war of 1812. The more important one was Napoleon invading Russia, but there was also a conflict between America and Canada, the Dominion of Canada. It's not formed yet, but it's British North America, which will turn into Canada later. So there's Admiral Nelson. There's Admiral Nelson and his legacy, and I mentioned about Napoleon, Dickens, Austen, and Queen Victoria. The chapter closes out with Mark Twain. So that's it, to page 182. We covered the whole chapter pretty quickly. So basically use your notes from Friday's lecture about industrialization. Make sure you read the chapter. It's 151 to 182, so it's 31 pages. And definitely some of the material I couldn't cover completely in lecture, so make sure you read all of the chapter and make notes of important things that I mentioned in lecture and what you read. Make some good notes. That's it for today. Thank you for listening as usual. And yeah, we're on the home stretch now. There's about a month left of class. As I said, December 14th is about exactly a month away. So quiz number 5 on Friday. Make sure you're not late. Starting the quiz just after 11, and I'll see you in room 124 as usual. Have a good week.